In this presentation, we will take a look at balance sheet report options within QuickBooks Online. Here we are in our QuickBooks Online test drive file for Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. We're going to scroll on down to our reports on the left side. Not really scrolling, but going down to the reports on the left side. We're going to go back into our balance sheet. This time I'm going to go in there with the favorite reports up top, the balance sheet being one of our favorite reports, if not the favorite report. Then I'm going to make a new tab. We're going to duplicate this tab once more. So we're going to be putting our cursor on the tab up top, right-clicking on it, and then we will duplicate it as is our custom. That way we have this tab to the left if we need to do any other changes, and we can just basically be working with our report with the tab to the right. That's customarily how I would set things up. Now I'm going to make this a bit larger again. I'm going to use the scroll option to do that. I'm holding down Control, and I'm scrolling up. And that's going to be at 125. Let's keep it there for now. I'm going to close the hamburger over here. So I close the menu option, the hamburger. All right, so this is going to be the balance sheet that we saw prior. We saw this in a previous presentation. Now we want to think about the options for customization. Now we're going to first consider these options that are basically here in the front screen, all the options that are going to be up front. You would think then these options are going to be the core options that would be most used. That's why QuickBooks pulled them out to the top of the report. Then in future presentations, we'll go into the more customized options up top here. So right now we're looking at the options that are at the front of the report. Now clearly what we're going to start off with, and we've already seen this multiple times, is you've got to change the date sometimes. So at any time there's a problem, if you pull up the report and you're like, it's not doing what I would think, no matter how many times you probably know this multiple times, it's probably a date problem. And so that's the first thing you want to think. Is the date off? Is there something wrong with the date? And then go up top and change the date, and then typically that's going to be how many problems with the reporting, many frustrations can be avoided if you check the date and make sure we're on the correct date range. Now there's different date ranges we can use up top. We can use this drop down up top, which can help pull up the correct dates without having a customized date range. So we can say we want this week. We can want this week to date, we got this month and quarter, and so on and so forth. The default will typically be this year to date, so that'll often be the default that will pull up when you're going into QuickBooks. And then of course we have last week, and we have a bunch of options here. Now if you want a custom date, then as we have been doing, you can select the custom date here, for example 01/01/19 to 12/31/19. Notice that's probably the fastest way that you can enter the dates into the system, and I've been doing that a few times. So just note that using the tab key is very useful for all of QuickBooks. I'm going to recommend it. It'll be a bit tedious, but I'm going to say I'm going to tab, because if you tab through the report, that's faster to do than if you just pick up the mouse all the time. So to put this in there as easy as possible, 01/01/19 would be the fastest way. If you hit tab, then it'll populate the report. Now every time you make a change to the report, for the report to then take that change and make the changes, you have to then run the report. So then we're going to go to run the report on the right side after every change. Okay, next item we have down here, we have the total only, or we have multiple other options other than the total. So typically the default, once again, will be the total. Now when you're thinking about a balance sheet, remember what you're typically thinking of. And these options will be the same in different reports as well. So as we go through some of these options, we're not going to go through them in as much detail when we talk about other reports, because they'll be much the same. But as you think of reports that are different in nature, for example, the balance sheet being as of a point in time, as opposed to an income statement, which needs a time frame, a beginning and an end, then the application of some of these options will be, you think about them a little bit differently. As you're thinking about the balance sheet, remember what you're thinking about is this is what it is as of a point in time, and this date therefore only has one date rather than a date range. You kind of want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about time frames up top. So for example, this time frame that we put in up top, you might go, hey, that's repetitive. Why do I need a time frame? Because if I scroll down here, it's as of December 31st. What does it matter what the beginning date is? And it really doesn't. I mean, in terms of this report, like if I change this date range to 07/01/19, or even if I make it 1 month, 12/31/19, and if I haven't refreshed it yet, you'll look at these numbers down below. I'm at 23/4/436, and then if I refresh this, if I run the report, you'll see there's no change. This report didn't change. What does it matter? I mean, why would they give me even a date range? Why wouldn't they just give me one date? Well, one reason is because the zoom feature is one of the main functions of this report. So for example, if I want to know the detail in the checking account, if I click on it, then I get that transaction detail report. And if I only have 1 month's worth of data, I don't get all the detail that I want, right? And so if I go back up top and I say, okay, I want the full year's worth of data, I'd say I'd like this to be as of 01/01/19 instead of 1 day. And then I run that report. And then I use the zoom feature, then I'm going to get that detail that I want. So that's one reason you want to set the date range even on the balance sheet, where you really only need the ending date to just run the report. So then I'm going to go back to the report summary. You want to keep that in mind as well when you think about like these different options, any kind of date options, the type of report you have. So we only have the totals only right now. Now, what if I wanted to basically have the months? So if I choose months, what's going to happen? And I run that report, then it breaks things out by month. So it has the end of each month, and no data was in there for the first part of the year. So it looks like data started to populate in the practice file for July. So now we have these items, and of course, this is as of the end of each month. If we chose this in a profit and loss report, it would be for the beginning to the end of each month. It would have the range of the months. Okay, we're going to change this back to years for now. So I'm going to select the drop down. We're going to go back to, actually, I'm going to change this back to the total only and run the report. So that's where back to our default. Then we have the active rows. So this drop down gives us, let's take a look at it. We have the rows active, all, or non-zero. So what does that mean? Active, all, or non-zero. So active means there's been activity within the cell. So in other words, if you looked at the chart of accounts, if I went back to the first tab here, and I went down to the accounting and the chart of accounts, and I looked at all the accounts down here that are going to be balance sheet accounts, it may very well be that I have more accounts down here than are being represented in the balance sheet. Why? Because there was no activity in them. So if there's no activity in them, then QuickBooks is going to say, I'm not going to put anything there if there's no activity in them. So that's great. That's typically a good thing to do. Now, what if there was activity and now it's still zero? It's a zero balance, but there was activity. Well, then you may actually want it. For example, this item down here, it's zero. Why would QuickBooks put a zero amount on the report? Well, possibly there was a situation where something happened to it. There was activity, and then it zeroed back out. A payable went up, and then it went down. And we might want that there because often people use this report for the zoom feature. I want to see the detail. If something happened in it this year, I want to go to the report and then be able to click on it so I can zoom into it and see the detail for it. So that means it's going to be active. If there's any activity, I'm going to go back then it's going to have that zero balance. But if there was no activity, then it wouldn't have the zero balance. And if I select the drop down then and I say non-zero activity and I say run that report, the zero item down here should now be gone. It should now not be there. And then if I scroll back up, and if I want all the accounts that are on the balance sheet, then I would say all accounts, and then we would run that report. So I run that report, and then all accounts should have zero, and then you should see even zero accounts that didn't have any activity in it. So those would be the general differences there. Again, the default will typically be the active ones, the ones that had activity had activity within it. So then we have the select the period here. So select the period. We'll go into a few of these options in more detail when we look at different types of reports. But here, notice we have the previous period and then we have the previous year. So for example, if I change the date range up top from 01, let's make it 12/1/19. So December 1st to December 31st, 2019, and run that report. And then I'm going to go back up top and I'm going to select this, and we want to say that we want the previous period. So I'm going to say I would like the previous period, and the previous period is going to be 11/1 to 11/30. So we're going to say that's the previous period, and then I'm going to run that report. Run that report. And now we have the previous period there. So we can have kind of like a comparison in this format. So we've got the December 1st in this item, and then November next to it. Again, in the balance sheet, we're talking about period end time. So this is as of the end of December, December 31st, and as of the end of November, November 30th. Now, if you want something like that, it's a little bit tricky. We'll go into this in more depth later when we make custom reports, but you have to basically put the current month in place and then choose the previous period rather than taking the 2-month time period, and putting it from November to December. So it's a little bit tricky, but not too difficult to get used to. And then you can add the dollar change. And so if we add the dollar change, then we're going to get another column for the change between the two. And then we can add the percentage change. I'm not going to give a lot of detail right now because we will make reports like this in the future, but then we can have a percentage change, and that'll add another column. So we'll actually analyze that in more detail in the future. If we select the drop down again, we could do the previous year, and then we got the percentage of the row items. So I'm going to remove these and go back to the default. So we're back to the default settings. So then we got the cash and accrual method. So notice when you think about the cash and accrual method, this is basically just changing when the system sees when they're going to be recognized income and expenses. So don't think that you can just basically select cash method and the whole thing is perfectly on a cash method, or you select accrual and the whole thing is perfectly on accrual, because it depends on how you enter the data. But the things in the data that are triggering when they're going to be recognizing the expenses, for example, on an accrual method, income is recognized basically when you enter the invoice, because that's going to be the triggering form. Now, you haven't gotten cash yet when you enter the invoice, so possibly the system within QuickBooks wouldn't be recording the income at that trigger point. But note that you can make an invoice and for the wrong time period, meaning you could have done the work way before and made the invoice today, and on an accrual basis, the invoice doesn't tie out to when the actual work was done. So, for example, if you did work for 2 weeks or a month or something like that, and you hadn't billed anyone for a month later because you needed to get the time and whatnot, technically the income should have been done a month before, even before you made the invoice out. So notice these are just the conventions within QuickBooks that are changing kind of the trigger points as to when you'd be recording revenue and expenses based on the forms, the data input, and when they've been put in the system. But in the default, so typically, again, no matter what system you probably use, you probably want to keep it on the accrual method, and therefore, meaning you may still be using kind of a cash method. You may be putting all your information into the system basically straight from the bank account, but still, you probably want your information on the default on the accrual side of things. But in any case, you can make this toggle right here and go to the cash method and run that report. And then if you scroll down, you'll have the change taking place. Notice what happened here is you don't have the accounts receivable account, and you don't have the accounts payable account, because notice those are accrual accounts. So those are things that are going to be removed on the balance sheet, because if you're on a cash method, you don't record the accounts receivable, because you don't record the income until the income is generated, and therefore you don't have the other side of it, which would be accounts receivable. You don't record the expense until it was incurred, or until it was paid, and on the other side, and therefore you don't have the accounts payable either. So typically you want the accrual method typically. And again, even if you're not using accounts receivable or accounts payable because you're kind of on a cash method, then you're going to enter it in a cash method anyways, because if you're just taking all your transactions straight from the bank account, then you may not be using accounts receivable or accounts payable, but you're still just entering the transactions directly into the system on a cash basis, and therefore you'd be on a cash basis even though you'd be on the accrual setting. So in any case, those are going to be those two settings. Then we have these items down below. We have the collapse feature down here. And if you had basically a lot of sub-accounts, this could be a way that it can simplify the reports. It would then collapse some of those sub-accounts. We don't have a whole lot in this report. And then we have the sorting. Now this can be kind of useful. You have the default sorting here, which typically, remember that the sorting is first by assets, liabilities, and then equity type of accounts. And then the type of accounts within the balance sheet, including the current assets, that would include the bank accounts, the accounts receivable, then the other, and then the liabilities and the fixed assets. So that's the account sorting. It's going to be by account type, because that's how a balance sheet works. But within those account types, for example, in these two accounts, then it's in by alphabetical order. So the checking account happened to be here versus the savings account because of alphabetical order within the account types. And this becomes even more apparent on the income statement or profit and loss report, because you have a lot of expenses. So here, for example, other current assets, you've got the zero balance up top because it happens to start with an A on here within the other current assets. Now, it may be the case that you want the loan on top because it's the biggest number. So oftentimes, then you could do that. You can do that with the settings up top and say sort. I'd like to sort it by descending order. And then if you scroll down, then within that account type, then the biggest number's on top. So that can actually be something that might, make it a little bit nicer to run the report. You also have your notes here. You can add a note. And then we took a look at some of these options, which include the emailing, the printing, and the exporting to Excel. We'll take a look at more of those examples of them as we look at future reports.